Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. Can you divide an existing Australian state and turn it into two smaller states? So, for example, could you take Queensland and divide it into Queensland and maybe Kingsland? In the Queensland Parliament, Robbie Katter moved a motion on the 22nd of May 2024, quote, that this House supports taking the necessary steps to form a separate state of North Queensland in accordance with section 124 of the Commonwealth Constitution, unquote. He argued that laws passed for the benefit of the southeast of Queensland were inappropriate for the north and that northern Queensland has become neglected when it comes to infrastructure. If North Queensland could have its own NRL football team, the North Queensland Cowboys, Katter argued, then it could be its own state as well. Now, someone on Twitter said, possibly facetiously, that what we really needed was a video from me, let's just say, dropping some bovine manure on the idea. Well, challenge accepted. Obviously, there are some practical issues about it. First, there's the issue of economic sustainability. While the intention seems to be to rely on coal mining royalties in North Queensland, that would not in itself be sufficient to establish all the institutional infrastructure needed for a new state and the public service necessary to manage it. Remember that the state would have to run its own school system, police, prisons, transport, land management, energy, emergency services, etc. You would lose economies of scale, and of course everything costs so much more when you're dealing with vast remote areas. Because of the disproportionately greater expense of serving remote regions, you would need a really strong tax base to support it, which North Queensland does not at present have. Moreover, there is a considerable risk that coal mining royalties will not be a long-term source of riches to rely on. Secondly, there just isn't the population to support it. Proponents of this idea point out that North Queensland has a greater population than Tasmania, but that in itself is not a great argument, because Tasmania already struggles both financially and with human capacity. When it comes to GST distribution, for example, Tasmania is effectively propped up by the tax collected in other states. It makes no sense to create new jurisdictions that suffer from the same problems. Third, when people come up with these ideas, they only consider the upside. So, for example, we'll take all the royalties from mining in North Queensland, but they don't consider how much of the debt of the state and other liabilities would be allocated to North Queensland in any breakup of the state, not to mention the cost of repairing and replacing aged infrastructure without having set aside resources to do so. It's not all ups, you get the downs as well. But let's go to the constitutional stuff, because that really is my area of expertise. Does the Constitution set out a process for such a change? First, the Commonwealth Constitution draws a distinction between original states, being those that joined at the time of federation, and new states. The point was to encourage Western Australia to get over the line and join federation from the beginning. To do so, the Constitution guaranteed original states equal Senate representation and a minimum of 5 seats in the House of Representatives, regardless of their population. Such a guarantee, of course, does not apply to new states. So a new state of North Queensland would not necessarily get 12 senators of its own, or even have the guarantee of a minimum of 5 House of Representatives seats. It would depend upon what was actually agreed with the Commonwealth Parliament. The Constitution sets out ways in which new states can be created. One way is by splitting off part of an existing state or by merging parts of 2 or more existing states. Section 124 of the Constitution says, "A new state may be formed by the separation of territory from a state, but only with the consent of the Parliament thereof, and a new state may be formed by the union of two or more states or parts of states, but only with the consent of the parliaments of the states affected. Prior to federation, splitting colonies into smaller, more governable sizes had commonly happened in the 19th century. For example, Victoria was separated from New South Wales in 1851. There had previously been a failed attempt to create a colony of North Australia, which included much of Queensland and the Northern Territory, back in 1846. Its capital was to be in Gladstone. It was intended to be a new penal colony after the transportation of convicts to New South Wales had ended, but it was abandoned by the British after a change of government in the UK. Instead, later, the Moreton Bay district of New South Wales was established as a separate colony of Queensland in 1859. During the 1890s, when federation was being debated, the colony of Queensland did not send representatives to the crucial 1897 to 1898 Constitutional Convention debates. Why? Because Queensland was consumed by an internal dispute about whether it should be divided into 2 or 3 separate provinces with its own federal structure. It was argued that geographically the size of Queensland was too big. The climate, lifestyle and needs of people in the south of the state, in Brisbane, were quite different from those of the people in Cairns or Cape York. The Queensland proposals for an internal federal system did not succeed, but there's still recognition of that dispute to be found in the Constitution. Section 7 provides for the possibility of senators in Queensland being chosen for separate divisions in the state, rather than the state as one electorate, in order to accommodate any federal system within Queensland itself. There have also long been proposals to split the New England area of New South Wales from the state to create a separate state. In 1924, New South Wales held a royal commission into proposals for the establishment of 3 new states: New England, Monero and Riverina. It concluded that this was neither practical nor desirable. In 1967, a referendum, or more accurately, a plebiscite, was held in the New England area to see whether local residents wanted the creation of a new state. It was defeated, with 54% voting against it. One of the problems was that people were asked to vote without knowing about the financial arrangements of the split, such as the allocation of debts and assets. Section 121 of the Constitution says that the Commonwealth Parliament may admit new states to the Commonwealth or establish new states, imposing such terms and conditions, including with respect to representation in either House of Parliament, as it thinks fit. As I mentioned earlier, Section 124 requires the consent of the Parliament of an affected state if a new state is to be formed by the separation of territory from an existing state. That means that both the Commonwealth and the Queensland Parliaments would have to consent to the establishment of a new state of North Queensland. Because the word Parliament is used, this means not only the consent of the Houses, but also the actual enactment of legislation by both jurisdictions. But it's also possible that other constitutional provisions would apply. Any action in splitting off part of a state to become a new state will ordinarily affect the borders of the original state. Section 123 of the Constitution says that the Commonwealth Parliament may alter the borders of a state with the consent of the state's parliament and, critically, the approval of the electors of the state voting upon the question. Doubts have been expressed about whether Section 123 would apply to the creation of a new state under Sections 121 and 124. But even if it's not technically required, and we can't be sure of that without litigation and a finding by the High Court, those doubts would drive public agitation for the holding of a vote. It seems to me inconceivable in political terms that the Commonwealth and Queensland Parliaments could create a new state of North Queensland without asking the people of Queensland for their approval, as any such change would also affect the proportionate representation of other states in the Commonwealth Parliament, not to mention potentially creating a financial burden on them to support North Queensland. It's also likely that the electors in the whole of Australia would want a say. One of the difficulties with creating a new state is determining what representation it should have in the Commonwealth Parliament. If Queensland, being an original state, were to divide, creating a state of North Queensland, the southeast part of the state would presumably retain its status as the original state of Queensland and therefore retain its 12 senators. But there would be a real question about how many senators would be allocated to the new state. The other states might also think it unfair if Queensland effectively got greater Senate representation by turning part of its territory into a new state. Further, as Section 24 of the Constitution says that the number of members in the House of Representatives shall be approximately twice those in the Senate, every time the Senate is increased by, say, 12 senators, then 24 extra members of Parliament must be added to the House of Representatives. The Australian people are unlikely to be happy about creating 36 new politicians. All up, these issues are far more difficult than they appear at first glance. Anyone contemplating going down this track would be well advised to look at the report of the Royal Commission into creating those 3 new states in New South Wales from the 1920s. It's not something that a simple motion in Parliament can come anywhere close to resolving, and I don't think we'll be seeing a separate state of North Queensland anytime soon. Not even the Queensland Parliament was prepared to support Katter's motion. But here's another interesting question. Could part of a state secede from the state and seek then to be established by the Commonwealth as a separate state without complying with Section 124 of the Constitution? This issue arose in the tumultuous days of the New South Wales Lang government during the Great Depression. The Lang Labor government defaulted on the state's foreign loans, and this aroused the ire of Earl Page, who was a Country Party supporter of the New State movement. Now, Earl Page is best known for later being Prime Minister for about 20 days after the death of Joe Lyons. Page, however, strongly supported new states, particularly in New South Wales. He argued that the default of New South Wales made it an outlaw and placed it outside the Constitution. Its government and Parliament would, he claims, cease to have legal standing. He argued that it was the duty of the people who were loyal to the Constitution to assert their authority and set up provisional governments to appeal to the Commonwealth Parliament for recognition as a state. This, of course, was complete nonsense. Defaulting on a loan does not put a state outside the Constitution or make it an outlaw, nor does it entitle people to overturn an elected government. But these were heady times and revolution was in the wind. Page summoned a conference in Armidale in February 1931, which endorsed his proposal for secession from New South Wales. In April 1931, a convention met in Maitland to adopt a new state constitution. It was to establish a legislative council of 25 members which would sit for no more than 38 days a year and have a 4-year term. Page put this proposal to the Scullin Labor government nationally, which rejected it. It preferred to use the courts to claim repayment of the interest that had been owed by New South Wales, which the Commonwealth itself had paid to the foreign lenders. After the Scullin government lost the December 1931 election, Page put the same idea to the United Australia Party government of Joe Lyons. Lyons too rejected it, preferring reliance on the law. Page, however, was not deterred. In April 1932, his new state movement met to agree on the boundaries of now 4 new states to replace New South Wales, and these would be based around Armidale, Wagga, Dubbo and Sydney. Each would have its own provisional government and its own constitution and seek recognition as a state by the Commonwealth. A tribunal would then allocate the assets and liabilities amongst them. Page wanted them to act immediately, but his brethren wanted to wait for Lang to commit what they called an overt act that would justify their revolution. They agreed to send a coded telegram to each other to signal the point at which they were going to take immediate action. Page also lobbied Lyons to get the Commonwealth to support their actions. But Lyons warned against it and said that the government might be forced to take action instead against this new state movement if it proceeded. Lang finally did take the step that would have triggered this secession on the 12th of May 1932, but their action was averted by Lang's dismissal the same day by the Governor, Sir Philip Game, for acting in breach of the law. All plans of revolution and new states were then set aside, but it had been a very close call. And it was indeed quite remarkable, I think, that a senior federal politician like Page, who later, as I said, did become Prime Minister, was not only prepared to contemplate it, but actually prepared to instigate it. Fortunately, wiser heads prevailed. Would it have been legal? Well, no. Section 124 of the Constitution requires the consent of the relevant state's parliament. Would it have been successful? Again, most likely no. Neither side of politics at the federal level was prepared to undermine the Constitution in this way, and rightly so. They relied on the rule of law. Hot heads do not lead to good governance. So no, this is not a model that North Queensland should follow. Thank you for watching the Constitutional Clarion. I hope you found this interesting, and I look forward to seeing you again next time. Goodbye.